The late December afternoon light streamed through the curtain gaps, casting golden stripes onto the dark wooden table. Martha kept her hands steady as she peeled potatoes, her eyes fixed on the repetitive motion of the knife, but her mind far away. George, seated in the rocking chair by the window, flipped through the newspaper without reading a single word. 62 years of marriage had taught that couple to converse through silence. And on that Christmas Eve, the silence spoke more than any words ever could. The ceiling fan spun slowly, stirring warm air that barely relieved the December heat. Through the half-open window, the distant sound of children playing in the street, the noise of cars passing, life following its normal course, while inside that house, something indefinable lingered in the air. Martha could feel it, a weight on her shoulders with no explanation, a restless unease in her chest that had been growing for weeks. Before we delve into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. Martha looked up for a moment and watched her husband. His sparse white hair combed back as always, his hands stained by time, holding the newspaper with a familiarity born of decades of routine. His reading glasses resting on the tip of his nose, those same glasses she was always adjusting because he insisted on letting them slip. She loved that man, loved every wrinkle, every spot, every lapse in memory that came with age. She loved the way he still looked at her sometimes, as if she were the 20-year-old girl he married in a small country church. The house smelled of old spices, those kept in glass jars inherited from Martha's mother. Clove, cinnamon, nutmeg, aromas that carried memories of Christmases past, when the children still ran through the hall and the table needed more chairs. Now, the children were adults, with their own lives, their own commitments. And that year, for the first time in a long time, all of them had confirmed their presence. Richard, the eldest, with his wife Patricia. Diane, the middle child, with her husband Frank. And Matthew, the youngest, who would come alone, as always. Martha should have been happy. After all, it was all a mother could want, to have her children gathered. On Christmas Eve, around the table she herself had lovingly prepared, but there was something that didn't fit, a piece out of place in the puzzle of that celebration. In recent weeks, she had noticed strange movements, conversations interrupted when she entered the room, glances exchanged between her children that seemed to carry a weight she couldn't decipher. The phone rang, breaking the afternoon silence. The shrill sound echoed through the house like an unexpected alarm. George made a move to get up, supporting himself on the arms of the chair, but Martha was quicker, drying her hands on her apron. Before walking to the landline phone they still kept in the living room, one of the few left in the neighborhood, a relic of a time when things seemed simpler. "Hello?" Her voice came out controlled, but her fingers gripped the receiver with unnecessary force. "Mom, it's me, Richard." Her son's voice sounded rehearsed, artificial, as if he were reading a script. "Just calling to confirm we'll be there around 7. Patricia wants to know if she needs to bring anything." Martha frowned. She knew that tone. It was the same one he used when he wanted something, when he called to ask for favors disguised as courtesies. "No need, son. Everything's ready." "Are you sure? We can help prepare the dishes if you want. Make the salad, season the meat, set the table." The offer was so out of character that Martha needed a moment to process it. In 40 years, Richard had never offered to help in the kitchen. The eldest son, who at 12 complained when asked to dry dishes, who as a teenager pretended not to hear when called to set the table, who as an adult barely entered the kitchen during visits, that same son now wanted to help season the meat? "Thank you, but I've got it. I always have." "Okay then. See you later." She hung up the phone and stood there, holding the receiver against her chest. Her heart was beating a little faster than it should. She returned to the kitchen, but her movements were no longer the same. There was a tension in her shoulders, a watchfulness in her gaze that wasn't there before the call. George folded the newspaper and observed her from the corner of his eye. He knew that expression. It was the same one she had when the children were little and were up to something hidden in the backyard. "What is it, Martha?" She took a moment to respond, choosing her words carefully. "Nothing," Richard called to confirm. "And that worried you?" Martha let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Don't you think it's strange, George? All three of them confirming so far in advance, offering to help, asking about documents, wanting to know if we're in good health. When was the last time they cared like this?" George took off his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. "They're our children. Martha, maybe they've matured. Or maybe they want something." The words came out more bitterly than she intended. She regretted them immediately, but didn't retract them. There was too much truth in them to be swallowed back. The afternoon advanced slowly, as if time itself were reluctant to reach that night. Martha finished preparing the stuffing, checked the turkey in the oven, arranged the cloth napkins she only used on special occasions. Each gesture was filled with silent dedication, with a love that overflowed in small things, in the exact seasoning of the rice, in the table decoration, in the fresh flowers picked from the garden. As she worked, her mind traveled through memories. She remembered Richard at 5, crying because he was afraid of Santa Claus. Teenage Diane, helping to make Christmas dinner for the first time, proud to finally be considered an adult. Baby Matthew, sleeping on her lap while the others opened presents. These were memories of a time when love seemed simple, unconditional, guaranteed. When did things change? Perhaps it was gradual, imperceptible, like the changing seasons. The children grew up, went their own ways, built their own lives. Visits became more spaced out, calls shorter, hugs more formal. Martha understood. Adult life was like that, full of commitments and hustle. But there was something more, something she began to notice in recent months, a coldness she couldn't ignore. She remembered when the children were small and the house was always full. Richard teaching his siblings to ride bikes in the backyard, Diane putting on plays for the family in the living room, Matthew sleeping on her lap while they watched television. The house smelled of homemade food, of clean laundry hung on the line, of childhood. Now it smelled of silence and of two old people, living within walls that held more memories than presents. It all started when George had that pneumonia in August. Nothing serious, just a week in the hospital as a precaution. The doctors said it was common at his age, that he needed rest and antibiotics. Martha stayed by his bedside every day, holding his hand, chatting to pass the time, reading aloud the newspaper news that he couldn't hold by himself. It was during that week that the children appeared, all of them together, which was rare. They came with flowers, with fruit, with words of concern. But Martha noticed something strange in the questions they asked. They weren't just asking about their father's health, about his medications, about when he could come home. They were asking about other things, things that seemed out of place in that hospital and illness context. Richard wanted to know if the will was in order. He said it was just a precaution, that at this age it was better to have everything prepared, that he could recommend a trusted attorney. Diane asked about the life insurance, if it was updated, if the beneficiaries were correct. Matthew, always the most direct, went even further. He suggested that perhaps it was time for his parents to think about the future, consider a smaller place, easier to care for, perhaps even an assisted living community where they would have assistance. At the time, Martha attributed it to the natural concern of adult children. After all, she and George were already in their 80s. It was understandable that the children would want to prepare, that they would think about the future, that they would worry about practical matters. She tried not to see ulterior motives where perhaps there was only prudence. She tried to believe the best, as she always did with her children. But the following weeks brought more signs, small clues that alone meant little, but together formed a disturbing pattern she could no longer ignore. There was Diane's surprise visit on a Saturday morning, without warning, claiming she was just passing by. She insisted on checking things out with her parents' medications, organizing the bottles on the kitchen counter, asking about dosages and times with an attention she had never shown before. As she left, she asked to photograph the medication list, just to have a record, she said, but didn't explain why she would need such a record. There were Richard's messages asking for photos of the house documents, just for the records too. The property deed, the title, the property tax payment receipts. He said he was organizing a family file, that it was important to have everything digitized. Martha sent the photos without thinking much, but later she wondered why her son would need copies of documents that didn't belong to him. There were Matthew's calls always at the same time, 10 in the morning, punctually, asking if everything was okay, if they needed anything, if they had slept well. The questions were always the same, repeated with almost mechanical precision, as if he were fulfilling a task instead of demonstrating affection. Martha began to wonder if he was monitoring his parents' routine, checking if they were awake, alert, functional. And there were, above all, the conversations that stopped when she entered the room, the exchanged glances that carried secrets, the smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Martha was no fool. She had lived long enough to recognize when someone was plotting something. She just didn't want to believe that her own children could be capable of anything that would hurt her. The sun began to set as she finished the last preparations. The table was set, the food almost ready, the house immaculate. She looked around and felt a tightness in her chest. That house held the story of an entire life. The marks on the wall where she measured the children's height, the armchair where George read stories to his grandchildren, the kitchen where so many meals were lovingly prepared. It was more than a property. It was the materialization of decades of dedication, sacrifice, and dreams. Was that what her children wanted? The house, the assets accumulated with so much effort? She pushed the thought away, feeling ashamed of herself for being suspicious. They were her children, her own flesh and blood. They couldn't want to harm her, but intuition insisted, like a low voice that refused to be silenced. At 6:30, George appeared in the kitchen, already dressed in the dress shirt Martha had ironed for the occasion. He looked tired, but there was a sparkle in his eyes, the anticipation of seeing his children, of having the house full again. "You look lovely, Martha." She smiled, adjusting the pearl necklace she had received for their 50th wedding anniversary. "You too, old man." Approached and hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. For a moment, they were just two old people in love, waiting for their family for Christmas dinner. For a moment, there was no suspicion or fear. "It's going to be a good night," he said, more to himself than to her. Martha didn't answer. She just covered his hands with hers and prayed in silence that he was right. At precisely 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house like a warning, a premonition of what was to come. Martha took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs and slowly escape. She smoothed her dress with her palms, checked her hair in the hallway mirror, straightened her shoulders. She was a mother about to welcome her children for Christmas dinner. That was what she should be, and that was what she would pretend to be, at least for now. On the other side of the door, with wide smiles and colorful gift bags, were the 3 children she had raised with so much love. Richard with his wife Patricia, he in a blue dress shirt, she in a festive red dress, Diane with her husband Frank bringing the promised dessert platter, and Matthew, alone as always, but with a smile that seemed too rehearsed to be natural. "Mom!" they exclaimed almost in unison, as if they had practiced it. The hugs came, one after another. Martha felt her children's bodies against hers, noticed the tension in their shoulders that should have been relaxed, saw how their gazes crossed over her shoulder. Silent messages exchanged between accomplices. She didn't yet know about the powder in Diane's pocket. She didn't know about the group chats, the carefully elaborated strategy, the envelope that would be opened as soon as her back was turned. She didn't know that every smile was a lie, every hug a betrayal in gestation. But when she closed the door and guided them into the house she had built with sweat and sacrifice, she felt deep in her chest that her intuition was right. Something was very wrong. And before that night ended, she would discover exactly what, and make her children pay a price they would never imagine. The hugs were quick, almost mechanical, devoid of the warmth they should have had. Richard entered first, stepping with familiarity onto a floor that hadn't belonged to him for decades. In his hands, he carried a bottle of imported wine, the kind that cost more than Martha spent in a week's groceries, and placed it on the coffee table with a studied theatrical gesture. It was a gift that said, "Look how generous I am," more than, "Look how much I love you." Patricia, his wife, went straight to the kitchen without properly greeting her in-laws, murmuring something about checking if they needed help. Her high heels echoed down the wooden hallway, a sound Martha always found grating in a simple house like theirs. Her daughter-in-law had never liked them, had never bothered to hide the disdain she felt for that little neighborhood house, while she and Richard lived in a luxury apartment on the south side. Diane came right after, carrying the dessert platter covered with aluminum foil. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Those same eyes Martha had seen truly sparkle when her daughter was a child and received a new doll. Now they were adult eyes, calculating, always evaluating, always measuring. "Mom, it smells wonderful," Diane said, kissing her mother's cheek. "You've outdone yourself this year." Martha accepted the compliment with a nod, noticing how her daughter kept the platter firmly in her hands, with no intention of letting her see what was inside. "Leave that dessert in the kitchen, dear, on the counter near the fridge." "I'll put it, Mom. No need to worry." Frank, her son-in-law, greeted his in-laws with a formal handshake that seemed more like an obligation than a gesture of affection. He was a man of few words, always had been, but lately his silence seemed to carry a different weight. He went to sit on the sofa, his cell phone already in hand, taking refuge in the screen like someone fleeing an uncomfortable situation. Last came Matthew, the youngest, the baby of the family, even at 42, still treated like the little one. He hugged his mother for too long, squeezing with an intensity that didn't match normal visits. Martha felt his body tremble slightly against hers, nervousness, guilt, and when they pulled apart, she noticed her son's eyes were moist. "Are you okay, son?" she asked softly. "Everything's fine, Mom." He smiled, but it was a fragile, almost desperate smile. Just Christmas emotion. Martha didn't believe him, but kept the observation to herself. Martha observed everything with the eyes of someone searching for clues. Every movement, every word, every silence was recorded and filed away deep in her memory. She didn't yet know what she was looking for, but she knew she would find it. The living room filled with voices, forced laughter and comments about the weather, traffic, the December heat. George, oblivious to the tensions Martha perceived, served drinks and told old stories that the children pretended to listen to with interest. It was as if everyone was playing roles in a rehearsed play, each fulfilling their function without ever deviating from the script. In the kitchen, out of sight of their parents, Richard gathered his siblings. The door was ajar, not closed, a carelessness that would prove costly. The voices were urgent whispers, words that should not exist between siblings, much less about their own parents. "Is everything all set?" Richard asked in a low voice, his eyes fixed on the door, watching for any movement. Diane nodded, her hand automatically going to her pants pocket, where she kept the small envelope. The paper was thin, almost transparent, and she could feel the weight of the powder through the fabric, a weight that seemed much greater than those few grams should have been. I bought it at the health food store, the one downtown. Her voice was a thread, almost inaudible. The salesperson guaranteed it's safe. It just causes a temporary discomfort. About 2 hours of dizziness, mental confusion, muscle weakness. Nothing permanent, nothing that leaves lasting effects. Are you sure? Matthew seemed nervous, his fingers tapping on the granite counter in a frantic rhythm. What if there's a reaction? They're old, Richard. Mom has high blood pressure. Dad just had pneumonia. I researched it, Matthew. Richard cut him off impatiently. It's a natural compound, herb-based. The most that can happen is they sleep a little longer than expected. It won't kill anyone. The word kill hung in the air, too heavy for that kitchen that had once witnessed only love and dedication. What if someone notices? Matthew insisted, his voice rising a tone despite the effort to maintain a whisper. No one will notice, Richard said, taking control as he always did. He was the eldest, the self-proclaimed leader, the one who since childhood decided the games, chose the teams, dictated the rules. We'll mix it into their food, the stuffing or the rice, wait for it to take effect, and when they start feeling sick in front of everyone, we'll pretend to be concerned, cry a little if we need to, and then gently suggest that perhaps it's time to rethink who takes care of what in this family. Richard looked at his siblings, his eyes coldly calculating every detail like someone analyzing a risky investment. Uncle George will be here, Aunt Claire, the cousins. Everyone will see the old folks confused, disoriented, stumbling over words, unable to form a proper sentence. They'll see Dad calling Mom the wrong name. They'll see her forgetting where she is. It's the proof we need to start the conservatorship proceedings. Conservatorship, Diane repeated the word, savoring it as if it were a forbidden treat. Guardianship. We take over everything, the house, the accounts, the investments, and they remain under our responsibility, living right here, but without decision-making power. Exactly. Richard smiled, satisfied to see that at least his middle sister understood the plan. It's legal. It's clean. No one goes to jail. We're just protecting our parents from themselves. Protecting, Matthew murmured, the sarcasm weighing in the word. This isn't protection, Richard. This is a scam. It's an investment. The older brother was unfazed. Do you know how much this house is worth? $2 million at least. The country property, another $500,000. Their savings, the investments Dad made his whole life. We're talking about nearly $4 million in assets sitting here, just waiting for them to die, so we have to fight over the inheritance. Why wait? Why let this money rot while we're killing ourselves to pay the bills? Diane placed a hand on her younger brother's shoulder. It's not about hurting them, Matthew. It's about protecting what's ours by right. If we can prove they're no longer capable of managing their assets, we take over the conservatorship. It's legal, it's clean, no one goes to jail. What if it goes wrong? Richard shrugged. It won't. It's just a natural powder. It won't even show up in tests. From the hallway, Martha heard every word. She'd approached silently when she noticed her children disappearing into the kitchen, and now she stood there, hidden behind the wall, her heart beating so hard she was afraid they could hear it. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, a pain that tore through her, transforming each breath into a battle. So this was it. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't exaggerated intuition. Her children, the children she had nursed, rocked to sleep, taught to walk, to talk, to be people, were planning to poison her. Not to kill, perhaps, but to humiliate, to destroy her dignity in front of the family, to take what she and George had built with a lifetime of work. Martha leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. Tears came, silent and hot, streaming down her aged face, but she didn't let a single sob escape. Not there, not now. She needed to think. She returned to the living room silently, sat next to George, and took his hand. He looked at her in surprise. It had been a long time since they had shared such a gesture in public, but said nothing. He simply squeezed her fingers and continued talking to his brother-in-law about football. The minutes passed like hours. Martha watched her children come and go from the kitchen, saw Diane approach the turkey platter with the envelope discreetly in hand, noticed the look she exchanged with Richard before returning to the living room. She knew the moment was coming. She knew that soon she would serve her own children a poisoned meal with her own hand. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that Martha wasn't the fragile, inattentive old woman they thought they knew. She had raised 3 children practically alone, while George worked from dawn to dusk in the construction business. She had managed the household on a minimum wage, stretching every penny until it seemed like a miracle. She had faced recessions, inflation, economic crises, illnesses, losses. She had buried her own parents, her older brother, 2 best friends. She had survived breast cancer at 60 and returned stronger than before. Martha was not weak. She never had been. And if her children wanted a battle, they would find a worthy adversary. She rose from the sofa with a calm that surprised herself and went to the kitchen. The children immediately dispersed, each pretending to be busy with something. Diane fiddled with dishes that didn't need to be fiddled with. Richard checked his phone. Matthew stared out the window as if the backyard were the most interesting thing in the world. "I'm going to start serving," Martha announced, her voice perfectly controlled. "Who wants to help me carry the platters?" Diane immediately offered, almost too eagerly. "I'll help, Mom." "No, dear. You've already done so much. Bringing that dessert?" Martha smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Richard, can you take the turkey? And Matthew, bring the rice." The children obeyed, each carrying a platter to the table. Martha took the last one, the special stuffing that she knew had been the target of the powder. She saw the almost imperceptible residue on the edge of the container, the slight deviation in color in a specific corner. Her children weren't as careful as they thought. She walked to the table, placed the platter in the center, and looked around. The family was all there, George at the head, the children and their spouses, the relatives who had gradually arrived, all waiting for Christmas dinner, all oblivious to the poison resting among the festive dishes. Martha took a deep breath and made a decision. "Before we serve," she said, her voice firm, "I want to propose something different this year." Everyone stopped to listen. "This Christmas, I want each of you to serve the other's plate. A demonstration of love and care. Richard, you serve your father. Diane, you serve Uncle George. Matthew, you serve Aunt Claire, and so on." The silence that followed was heavy, dense, charged with meanings that only a few understood. Martha saw the panic in her children's eyes, the exchange of desperate glances, the late realization that the plan had failed. "What a beautiful idea, Martha," Aunt Claire said, clapping. "It's been years since we've done something like this." The relatives agreed, excited by the suggestion. The children had no choice but to participate, lest they seem strange, insensitive, suspicious. One by one, they began to serve each other's plates, and the poisoned stuffing ended up ironically on Patricia's plate, served by Richard himself, who couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. Martha watched her son's wife look at the plate with distrust, poke the stuffing with her fork, and bring a small portion to her mouth. For a moment she felt a pang of guilt. Patricia had nothing to do with it. She was just another piece in the children's game. But the portion was small. The effect would be minimal. And in any case, it was too late to turn back. Dinner began in tense silence, each eating slowly, glancing sideways at the others. The children barely touched their own food, constantly checking their parents for signs of discomfort that never came. Richard nudged Diane under the table. Diane made a discreet gesture of confusion. Matthew was pale, his eyes darting from face to face. Half an hour passed, an hour. Martha and George remained perfectly fine, talking, laughing, savoring every bite. It was the children who began to look unwell, not from the powder, but from the anxiety, the fear, the guilt that gnawed within. And it was Patricia who first felt the effects. It started with a slight dizziness, a cold sweat on her forehead. She put down her fork and brought her hand to her head, blinking several times as if trying to focus her vision. Richard noticed immediately, his face losing all color. "Honey, are you okay?" Patricia tried to answer, but the words came out garbled, confused. She leaned on the table, then on her husband's arm, her eyes lost, disoriented. I don't know. Everything's spinning." Panic spread around the table. Aunt Claire rushed to get water. Uncle George asked if he should call an ambulance. Diane and Matthew were paralyzed, understanding what had happened, unable to say anything. And Martha just watched. She watched the chaos her children had created turn back on them. She watched Richard holding the wife he himself had accidentally poisoned. She watched Diane and Matthew exchanging horrified glances, realizing that the plan had not only failed, it had hurt an innocent person. She watched, and felt a mixture of pain and satisfaction that she couldn't separate. Christmas night had only just begun, and before it ended, Martha would ensure her children understood exactly what they had tried to do. The living room transformed into a stage of contained despair. Patricia sat on the sofa, her head resting on the back, her eyes half closed. The dizziness seemed to have lessened a bit, but she still murmured disconnected phrases, her hands trembling every time she tried to hold the glass of water offered to her. Richard was beside her, his face devastated by a guilt he couldn't confess, repeating that everything would be fine, that it was just a passing upset, that there was no need for a hospital. "Are you sure?" Uncle George asked, his cell phone already in hand. "She's very pale, Richard. It could be something serious." "It's not serious." His eldest son's voice trembled. "She must have eaten something that didn't agree with her. She just needs to rest." Martha watched the scene from the corner of the room, her arms crossed over her chest. Beside her, George also watched, but with a different expression. Confusion, genuine concern, without understanding what was happening. He didn't know. He knew nothing. And Martha hadn't yet decided if she should tell him. In the kitchen, Diane and Matthew whispered urgently, "What do we do now?" Matthew was almost in a panic, rubbing his hands non-stop. "Patricia took the powder. Patricia, Diane, not the old folks." I know. Diane paced back and forth, biting her nails. "It was a mistake. Mom changed everything with that idea of serving each other's plates." "She knows," Matthew said suddenly, stopping mid-movement. "She knows, Diane. Why else would she do that? Don't be ridiculous. Mom doesn't know anything. It was a coincidence." "Coincidence? She's never proposed such a thing in 60 years of Christmases, and precisely today she decides to change tradition, just when we—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Diane remained silent for a long moment, processing. She looked at the kitchen door, beyond which her mother remained as still as a sentinel. "If she knows," she finally said, "why didn't she say anything? Why didn't she call the police, kick us out, make a scene?" It was a good question. A question Matthew couldn't answer. In the living room, Patricia began to feel better. Color returned to her face, her eyes focused more clearly. The effect of the powder, as promised, was not permanent. Just a few hours of discomfort, confusion, vulnerability. Enough to create a scene, but not enough to cause real harm. "I'm better," she said, her voice still weak. I think it was just dizziness. Must be the heat, the excitement. The relatives sighed in relief. The interrupted dinner gradually resumed, with softer conversations, more forced laughter. But the atmosphere had changed. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a sense that something was wrong, that night held secrets yet to be revealed. Martha remained silent throughout the confusion. She didn't offer help, didn't show excessive concern, didn't ask questions. She just watched. And when Patricia said she was better, she simply nodded and returned to the table as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Aren't you going to ask what happened?" Frank, Diane's husband, approached her with a curious expression. "What is there to ask?" Martha responded calmly. "The young lady felt unwell. She's better now. It happens." Frank frowned, clearly dissatisfied with the answer, but didn't press. He returned to his wife's side, whispering something Martha didn't care to hear. Dessert was served in silence. The sweets Diane had brought, a chocolate trifle, a vanilla custard, were praised with feigned enthusiasm. No one was very hungry after the scare, but social conventions required eating, praising, pretending everything was normal. Richard ate nothing. He stayed by, Patricia's side the whole time, holding her hand, his eyes fixed on the floor. Martha knew that expression. It was the same one he had as a child after doing something wrong and getting caught. Guilt stamped on his face, the inability to look his victim in the eye. Only this time he hadn't been caught, at least not officially. At 10 o'clock, the relatives began to leave. Uncle George was the first, citing tiredness. Aunt Claire followed soon after, taking the cousins who were already dozing on the sofa. One by one, the guests said their goodbyes, wishing Merry Christmas, with tight hugs and promises to see each other more next year. When the door closed behind the last visitor, only Martha, George, and their 3 children with their spouses remained. The living room, which minutes earlier had been full of voices and movement, now seemed strangely empty, too silent. "Well," Richard said, standing up, "I guess we should get going too. Patricia needs to rest." "Sit down." Martha's voice wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that made everyone stop. Richard, who was already standing, hesitated. He looked at his siblings for support, but found only confused faces. "Mom, it's late. I said sit down." George looked at his wife, surprised. In 62 years of marriage, he could count on one hand the times he had heard her use that tone. It was the tone she reserved for serious moments, for conversations that allowed no interruption. "Martha, what's going on?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly stood up, walked to the bookshelf where she kept family photo frames, and picked one up. An old photo, taken when the children were still young. Richard was about 10, Diane 8, Matthew 5. They were all at the beach, smiling, their hands full of sand. "Do you remember this day?" she asked, showing the photo. The children exchanged confused glances. "It was during vacation at the beach," Diane said cautiously. "We went every year." "Every year," Martha agreed, looking at the photo as if she could step into it. "Those were the only vacations we could afford. Your father worked all year, 12 hours a day, to save enough money for 1 week at the beach. And you were so happy." "Mom, where is this going?" "I remember every sleepless night taking care of your fevers." Martha continued, ignoring the interruption. "Every heavy grocery bag carried on foot because there wasn't money for a taxi. Every school, every doctor, every toy we bought with sacrifice. I remember everything, every choice we made so you could have a better life than ours." The silence in the room was absolute. Even Patricia, still dizzy, paid attention. "And I always thought it had worked." Martha's voice trembled for the first time. "I thought I had raised good people, people of character, people who knew the value of things, who respected those who came before, who understood that family is more than just inheritance. Richard swallowed hard. "Mum, I don't know what you know." She stared at him directly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "All three of you know. Do you think I'm deaf? Do you think I'm blind? Do you think after 82 years of life I haven't learned to recognize when my own children are plotting against me?" The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. Diane turned pale. Matthew began to cry silently. Richard tried to maintain his composure, but his clenched jaw betrayed him. "I heard you in the kitchen," Martha said, each word falling like a stone. "I heard about the powder, about the plan, about how you were going to make us seem incompetent to take over the conservatorship. I heard everything." George, who until then had been in stunned silence, turned to his children with an expression Martha had never seen on him, a mixture of disbelief and devastation. "Is this true?" No one answered. "I asked if it's true." His father's voice, always so calm, exploded like thunder. The children cowered in their seats, children again before parental fury. "Dad," Richard began. "Don't call me Dad." George stood up, his legs trembling with anger or rage. It was hard to tell. A father is proud of his children. A father trusts his children. You were going to poison us?" "It wasn't to hurt," Diane sobbed. "It was just to what? To steal what's ours? To throw us into a nursing home while you divide everything we spent our lives building?" The silence that followed was the cruelest answer possible. Martha watched her husband crumble, saw strength abandon that body that had always seemed unshakable. George sat back down, not by choice, but because his legs could no longer support him. His hands trembled, his eyes were moist. That image of the man she loved destroyed by his own children's betrayal hurt more than anything they could have done to her. And it was at that moment that Martha understood that the pain of that night was just the beginning. The clock on the wall read 11:20 at night. In other homes, families exchanged presents, toasted with champagne, waited for midnight with joy. In that living room, 6 adults remained in silence, each carrying a different weight: guilt, anger, disappointment, fear. Patricia was the first to break the silence. "You poisoned me?" Her voice was a thread, but it cut like a razor. "Richard, you let me eat that knowing what was in it." "I didn't know it would end up on your plate," he replied, unable to look at her. "It was meant for my parents." "As if that makes it any better." She stood up, swaying. "I'm leaving." "Patricia, wait. Don't touch me." She crossed the room, grabbed her purse from the sideboard, and walked out the front door without looking back. The sound of the car starting and driving away ripped through the night's silence. Richard stood there, staring at the closed door as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. "Satisfied?" Martha asked, without any kindness. "Mom!" Matthew, still crying, tried to approach her. "We made a mistake. We know we made a mistake. But try to understand." "Understand what?" "We're drowning in debt," Diane said, her voice choked. "Frank lost his job 8 months ago. The kids' school, the apartment, everything's overdue. And you two are here, sitting in this huge house, with money sitting idle in the bank, and you never offer anything." Martha stared at her for a long moment. "You never asked." "We shouldn't have." "To ask!" Richard exploded. "You're our parents. You see us killing ourselves and you don't lift a finger. How much money do you have invested, Mom? How much? Money that's just going to sit there until you die, and we have to fight over the inheritance." "So that's the justification." George raised his head, his eyes red. "You were going to humiliate us, declare us incompetent, strip us of our dignity. For money?" "It wasn't just for the money," Matthew said softly. "It was because we can't take it anymore, can't take waiting anymore, waiting for you to realize We need help, waiting for you to understand that life out there is hard, waiting for you to die to finally have something of our own." The words hung in the air, each heavier than the last. Martha felt as if someone had plunged a hand into her chest and ripped out something essential. "Waiting for us to die," she repeated slowly. "Is that what you do when you visit us? Calculate how much time is left?" No one answered. "I'm going to tell you a story." Martha sat in the armchair, suddenly looking much older than her 82 years. "When I was 25, my mother got sick. Cancer, the kind that has no cure. My father had already died, and I was the only child. I took care of her for 3 years until the end. I changed her diapers, bathed her, gave her medicine, stayed up all night holding her hand while she cried in pain." She paused, her eyes lost in memories. "When she died, I found out she had left everything to the church. The house, her savings, everything. Nothing was left for me. Nothing. Do you know what I did? I cried. A lot, but never, not once, did I think of poisoning her to take what was hers. It never crossed my mind that her money belonged to me by right." "Times were different," Richard murmured. "Times change. Decency shouldn't change." Frank, who had remained silent all this time, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Martha, I didn't know any of this. Diane didn't tell me." "I know." Martha looked at him with a shadow of compassion. "It's not your fault, Frank. You can go if you want. This is a family conversation." He hesitated, looked at his wife, and then at the door. For a moment it seemed he would stay, but the hesitation passed, and he stood up, picked up his car keys, and left without another word. Diane watched her husband leave with an empty expression, as if she were watching her life crumble in slow motion. "See," Martha pointed to the door, "this is what you did. Not only did you try to destroy us, you destroyed everything around you. Marriages, trust, family, for greed." "It wasn't greed," Matthew insisted, desperate. "It was desperation. We're desperate, Mom." "Desperate?" George stood up again, his anger renewed. "You have a stable job, Matthew. You make good money. You live in a nice apartment. Where's the desperation?" "I should be earning more at my age. I should have my own house, a new car, a better life. I look at my friends and see everyone growing while I stay in the same place. And that's our fault." George almost laughed, but it was a bitter, humorless laugh. "Are we responsible because you didn't know how to manage your life? You could have helped. You could have given us a down payment for an apartment, a car, something. But no, you prefer to save everything for what?" Martha interrupted. "Finish the sentence. We prefer to save for what?" Matthew couldn't. "I'll tell you for what." She stood up, walked to the window, and stared out into the night. "We save because we don't know how much time we have left, because medicine is expensive, doctors are expensive, caregivers are expensive, because one day we might need someone to bathe us, change our diapers, feed us by hand, and we wanted to be sure that when that day came, we wouldn't be a burden to anyone." She turned to face her children. "We save so we don't depend on you, because deep down we always knew you wouldn't be there when we needed you." The accusation fell on them like a sentence. Diane sobbed. Matthew hid his face in his hands. Richard remained motionless, his fists clenched. "That's not fair," he said finally. "We've always been present. Someone calls every week. Someone visits every month. You call to ask about documents. You visit to check if we're still alive." Martha took a step towards him. "When was the last time you called me just to see how I was, Richard, without asking about inheritance, about health, about the house?" He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. "I'll tell you when it was," she continued. "It was 7 years ago, when you needed me to co-sign for your apartment. Remember? You called me all sweet, asking about my arthritis, about the plants in the garden. and in the end you asked for my signature. Since then, every call, every visit, every gesture has had an ulterior motive. What about Diane? George joined his wife. Remember when you wanted us to sell the country property to pay for the children's private school? You said it was an investment, that it would yield more than keeping the land. You lied, saying public school was dangerous, just so we'd loosen our purse strings. Diane shrugged, unable to deny it. And you, Matthew? Martha looked at her youngest. My youngest, whom I always defended, always protected. How many loans have you taken from me in recent years? How many have you paid back? I was going to pay them. No, you weren't. She shook her head. We know you weren't. Just as we know that money would become another justification for the conservatorship. The parents are lending money without control. They don't know what they're doing with their finances anymore. The silence that followed was the longest of the night. Each child digesting the accusations, recognizing in each of them a truth they preferred not to see. What do you want from us? Richard finally asked, his voice defeated. Do you want us to leave and never come back? Do you want to disinherit us? What? Martha looked at her husband. George returned her gaze, and in that second, without exchanging a word, they made a decision together, as they had for 62 years. What we want, she said slowly, is for you to understand what you did, not with excuses, not with empty promises. Understand it truly, and then we'll decide what to do. She walked to the bookshelf, opened a drawer, and pulled out a thick envelope. This here, she held up the envelope, is the will we made 10 years ago. You were going to divide everything equally. The house, the money, the investments, the land. Everything. The children looked at the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode. Tomorrow morning your father and I are going to the attorney's office, and we're going to change this will. Mom, Diane began. I'm not finished. Martha cut her off. We're going to change it, but not in the way you're thinking. We're not going to disinherit anyone. Instead, we're going to donate half of everything to charities, nursing homes, orphanages, public hospitals. Half of what we spent our lives accumulating will go to those who truly need it. And the other half? Richard asked, his voice choked. The other half you're going to have to earn. She put the envelope back in the drawer and closed it. Now leave. Christmas. Night is over. The days that followed Christmas were the quietest that house had ever known. Martha woke early, as always, prepared coffee, watered the plants, took care of her routine with the same dedication as ever. But there was something different in the air, a weight that didn't dissipate, a wound that insisted on staying open. George, for his part, seemed to have aged 10 years in one night. He spent hours sitting in the rocking chair, staring into space, not reading the newspaper, not listening to the radio, doing nothing but breathing and remembering. When Martha tried to talk, he responded with monosyllables, as if words had run out along with his trust in his children. On the 26th, they kept their promise. They went to the attorney's office at 9 in the morning, sat before the notary public, and changed the will. The man, accustomed to all kinds of family drama, asked no questions. He simply drafted the new clauses, collected the signatures, and handed over the copies with a formal handshake. Outside, Martha held her husband's hand as they walked back to the car. We did the right thing, she said, more to herself than to him. George didn't answer. He just squeezed her fingers and kept walking. At home, the phone rang non-stop. Richard called 5 times on the first day, leaving messages that ranged from apology to despair. Diane sent a long email, full of justifications and promises of change. Matthew appeared at the door on the 27th, ringing the doorbell insistently until he realized no one was going to answer. Martha saw all this with a calm that surprised her. She expected to feel anger, resentment, a desire to scream, But what she felt was something different, a kind of bitter peace, the tranquility of someone who had finally stopped deluding herself. Her children were who they were. It wasn't going to change now. At the turn of the year, for the first time in decades, Martha and George celebrated alone. She prepared a small dinner, just enough for two, and they toasted with the champagne they had saved for a special occasion. At midnight, as fireworks exploded in the city sky, they hugged on the porch, two old people who had only each other. "Do you regret it?" George asked softly. "Regret what?" "Telling them, exposing everything. We could have pretended not to know. Let it. And go," Martha thought before responding. "No," she finally said. "If I had pretended, I would have spent the rest of my life looking at them and seeing liars. I prefer the truth, even if it hurts." He nodded slowly. "And now, what do we do?" "We live." She smiled, a small but genuine smile. "It's what we've always done." January arrived, hot and drawn out. The children's attempts to contact them gradually decreased, first a little less insistent, then spaced out, and finally rare. Richard stopped calling after 2 weeks. Diane sent a last email on the 15th, saying she would respect her parents' space. Matthew never appeared again. Martha discovered that absence hurt in a different way than betrayal. It was a dull, constant ache that appeared in the most unexpected moments, when she saw a mother with children at the grocery store, when she found an old photo in a drawer, when she cooked too much out of habit and realized she had no one to give it to. But she wouldn't let the pain win. She woke up, followed her routine, took care of George, took care of herself. It was in early February that something changed. One afternoon, while organizing old papers in the Home Office, Martha found a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside, dozens of letters, correspondences she exchanged with her mother before she got sick, notes from her children when they were small, birthday cards yellowed by time. She sat on the floor and began to read, one by one, diving into memories that seemed to belong to another life. There was a note from Richard, written in crooked child's handwriting. "Mummy, you're the best mum in the world. I love you to the moon and back." There was a drawing from Diane, a little house with 4 stick figures and a smiling sun in the corner. There was a letter from Matthew, written when he was about 12, thanking her for taking care of him when he was sick. Tears came before Martha could stop them. Not tears of anger or resentment, but of longing, a deep longing for those children who once loved her unconditionally, without ulterior motives, without calculations. Where had they gone? At what moment had they gotten lost along the way? George found her there, sitting amidst the papers, quietly crying. He sat beside her without saying anything, put his arm around her shoulders and let her cry until she ran dry. "They're not those children anymore," she finally said, her voice choked. "No," he agreed, "but somewhere, deep down, they still are. We just need to find it." Martha looked at her husband, surprised. "You want to forgive?" "I want to understand." He picked up one of the letters, Richard's childish handwriting stained by time. "We raised them. We must have done something right, because they were good children. If they turned out like this, maybe part of the blame is ours too." "Our blame?" Martha pulled away, indignant. "Are you defending them?" "I'm not defending them. I'm trying to think. We worked our whole lives, Martha. Worked so hard that maybe there wasn't time left to teach other things. We gave them food, clothes, school. But did we set an example? What example? An example of generosity," he sighed. "How many times did we help someone without expecting anything in return? How many times did we give up something of ours for another person? The kids grew up watching us save, hoard, economize. Did they learn that this was more important than sharing?" Martha fell silent, processing. It was a perspective she hadn't considered, the possibility that, to some extent, she and George had unknowingly planted the seeds of that greed. "That doesn't justify what they did," she finally said. "It doesn't justify, but maybe it explains." They spent the rest of the afternoon there on the office floor, rereading letters and memories, trying to find the thread that connected the past to the present. They didn't reach definitive conclusions. Life rarely offers simple answers. But something changed that afternoon, a beginning of understanding perhaps, or at least a willingness to try. The following week, Martha did something she hadn't done in months. She called Diane. The phone rang several times before being answered. Her daughter's voice, when she finally picked up, was cautious, almost fearful. "Mom, it's me." A long silence. Martha could hear her daughter's breathing on the other end of the line, could imagine the confusion on her face. "I didn't call to argue," she continued. "I called because I need to understand some things, and I think you do too. Mom, not now, in person. Can you come over tomorrow? Alone, without Frank, without your brothers, just you." Another silence, shorter this time. "I can," Diane finally said. "What time?" "In the afternoon, 3 o'clock. I'll be there." Martha hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say. She didn't have a plan or a script. She just knew she needed to look into her daughter's eyes and try to find the girl who once drew little houses with a smiling sun. George appeared at the living room door. "Did you call?" "I did." "And now?" Martha sighed. "Now we wait, and hope there's still something to save." Night fell slowly, bringing with it the coolness of February. Martha didn't sleep well. She kept thinking about what she would say, how she would say it, if she would be able to remain calm in front of the daughter who had participated in a plan to destroy her. But there was something stronger than anger, something that insisted on surviving despite everything, a mother's love. It was stubborn, this love, resilient. It refused to die, even when it had every reason to. And perhaps, Martha thought as she stared at the ceiling in the dark, it was precisely this stubbornness that might save what remained of the family, or condemn them forever. Only tomorrow would tell. Diane arrived at 3 o'clock sharp, punctual as she had never been. She parked her car in front of the house and stayed there for a few minutes, her hands on the steering wheel, gathering courage. Through the window, Martha watched her. She saw her daughter take a deep breath, run her hand through her hair, check her reflection in the rearview mirror. Small gestures of nervousness that betrayed her. When she finally rang the doorbell, Martha was already at the door. They looked at each other for a moment that seemed to last hours. Diane had deep, dark circles under her eyes, her face thinner, her hair without its usual shine. She seemed to have aged years in weeks. Martha wondered if she herself looked the same. "Come in," she simply said, making space for her daughter to pass. The living room was exactly as it always had been. The same furniture, the same photos, the same smell of coffee and cleaning products. But for Diane, it was like entering a courtroom, each object a silent testimony to what she had tried to do. "Sit down," Martha indicated the sofa. "Want some coffee?" "No, thank you." They sat at opposite ends of the sofa, like two strangers forced to share the same space. The silence between them was thick, almost palpable. "Where's Dad?" Diane asked, looking around. "He went to the pharmacy. I asked him to take a walk. I wanted to talk to you alone first." Diane nodded, intertwining her fingers in her lap. "Mum, before anything else, I need to say that—" "Don't start with excuses," Martha cut her off. "Excuses are easy. I want to understand. I want you to explain to me, truly, how we got to this point." Diane closed her eyes for a moment, as if searching for words in the dark. I don't know where to begin. Start from the beginning. When did you decide that poisoning your parents was an acceptable option? The rawness of the question made Diane flinch. She opened her eyes, shining with tears, and looked at her mother for the first time. It wasn't a one-day decision. It built up gradually. It started with complaints, you know? Richard saying you were getting old and not taking care of yourselves, that someone would have to take over things. At some point, I agreed, because I was also worried. Matthew joined the conversation, talking about debts, how hard it was. And from there to poison? Diane swallowed hard. From there to poison were months of conversation, of one convincing the other that it was the only solution. Richard said you would never help us willingly, that we needed to force the situation. At first I thought it was absurd, but he kept insisting, showing examples of other families who had done something similar, saying it was just a natural powder, that it wouldn't hurt anyone. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him. Diane's voice broke. Mom, you don't know what my life is like. Frank unemployed, the kids needing school, doctors, clothes. I work 12 hours a day and can't pay the bills. Every night I lie down thinking about how I'm going to make it to the end of the month. And then I looked at you two in this huge house with money in the bank, without a single worry. And you felt angry. I did, Diane admitted, lowering her eyes. Anger, envy, resentment, all mixed together. Why did you have so much, and I so little? Why didn't you help? Why did I have to struggle alone while you lived comfortably? Martha was silent for a moment, absorbing the words. Do you know why we didn't help, Diane? Her daughter shook her head. Because you never asked properly. Martha leaned forward. You came here, made veiled hints, dropped subtle clues, expecting us to guess and offer. But you never sat down, looked us in the eye and said, Dad, Mum, I need help. Can you lend me money? We were ashamed. Ashamed. Martha almost laughed. You were ashamed to ask for help, but you weren't ashamed to plan a scam. What kind of logic is that? Diane had no answer. I'm going to tell you something you don't know. Martha stood up, went to the bookshelf and picked up a brown envelope. This here is an insurance policy I took out 15 years ago. Do you know why? To ensure that when I died, the three of you would have enough money to resolve any emergency. Each of you is a beneficiary of an amount that would be enough to pay all your debts and still have some left over. Diane looked at the envelope with an expression that mixed surprise and horror. I didn't know. Of course you didn't know, because we don't go around parading what we do for our children. We do it and keep quiet. But you didn't want to wait. You looked at us and saw two obstacles in the way of money. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. Martha put the envelope back. And the worst wasn't the plan. The worst was that you looked at me and your father, two people who gave their lives for you, and decided that we didn't even deserve the dignity of growing old in peace. Diane began to cry openly, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Martha watched her for a moment, torn between resentment and the instinct to console. The instinct won. She approached her daughter and, after a hesitation, sat beside her. I didn't come here to destroy you, she said softly. I came because I need to know if there's still anything left to save between us. Diane raised her face, her eyes red and swollen. I messed up, Mom. I messed up so badly. I don't know if it can be fixed. I can't, Martha was honest. Maybe we'll never be what we were, but we can try to be something else, something new. How? Martha took a deep breath before responding. Starting with the truth. You need to tell me everything, not just what happened at Christmas, but everything that came before. The conversations, the plans, the justifications you created for yourselves. I need to understand the size of the hole to know if it can be crossed. And so, in the hours that followed, Diane told her story. She told about the messages in the siblings' group chat, about the hidden meetings in downtown cafes, about the internet searches for substances that cause mental confusion. She told about the doubts she had and ignored, about the time she almost gave up and was convinced to continue. She told about the fear of being poor, the fear of failing, the fear of not being enough for her own children. Martha listened to everything in silence. Each word was a stab, but she didn't flinch from any of them. She needed to know. She needed to see the extent of the betrayal, to decide if forgiveness was possible. When Diane finally finished, it was already night. The living room was dark, illuminated only by the light coming from the kitchen. The two women remained on the sofa, exhausted, emptied. "And now?" Diane asked, her voice hoarse. Martha took a moment to respond. "Now you go home. You think about everything you told me. You decide if you truly want to change or if you just came here to clear your conscience. And when you're sure, truly sure, you call me and we'll talk again." "What about my brothers?" "Your brothers will have to find their own way. I'll call each one separately, just as I called you. But forgiveness, if it comes, will be individual. Each one will have to earn theirs." Diane nodded slowly. She stood up, straightened her crumpled clothes, wiped her face with the back of her hand. At the door, she hesitated. "Mom?" "Yes?" "I love you. I know it sounds like a lie after everything, but I love you." Martha looked at her for a long moment. "I know," she finally said. "The problem is that love without respect is worth nothing, and you disrespected me in a way I never imagined possible." Diane lowered her head and left. Martha stood at the door, watching the car drive away until it disappeared around the corner. Only then did she allow her own tears to fall, tears of pain, of weariness, but also of a fragile hope that insisted on blossoming in the midst of the chaos. George returned half an hour later. He found his wife sitting on the porch, looking at the stars. "How did it go?" he asked, sitting beside her. "It was hard, but I think it was necessary." "Did you forgive her?" Martha thought before responding. "Not yet, but maybe one day I will. Maybe." He held her hand, and together they sat there, two old people under the February sky, trying to believe that there was still time to rebuild what their children had destroyed. The months that followed were a slow, painful, imperfect reconstruction. Martha spoke with each child, one at a time, in meetings that lasted hours and left everyone exhausted. Richard was the most difficult, too proud to admit the full extent of what he had done, too defensive to listen without interrupting. It took 3 conversations before he could look at his mother without trying to justify himself. Matthew, on the other hand, came with an open heart. He cried as he hadn't since childhood, begged for forgiveness on his knees, promised to change in a way that seemed genuine. Martha hugged him that day, the first true hug she had given a child since Christmas, and felt, for the first time, that there might be hope. The will remained as it was, half for charity, the other half conditional. But Martha and George decided something more. While they were alive, they would truly start helping their children. Not with large sums, not with early inheritances, but with practical gestures. A utility bill paid here, a school, tuition there, a transparent loan with a defined term. It was a way to show that love still existed, even if bruised, even if cautious. Patricia never forgave Richard. The marriage ended in March, with a quick and quiet divorce. She took their daughter and moved in with her parents in another city, leaving Richard alone in an overly empty apartment. He would call his mother sometimes, late at night, his voice slurred with alcohol, asking for advice he didn't follow. Martha listened, responded what she could, and then hung up with a heavy heart. Diane and Frank managed to get back on their feet. She accepted a job with lower pay but better hours, which allowed her to spend more time with her children. Frank found work at a small company without the benefits of his previous job, but stable. Slowly, the debts decreased. The tension at home eased. During visits to her parents' house, now monthly genuine without hidden agendas, Diane brought the grandchildren, and the house once again filled with the sound of children in the hallways. Matthew was the one who changed the most. He sold his expensive car, traded it for a used one, paid off his debts without asking anyone for money. He started visiting his parents every Sunday, helping in the garden, fixing things around the house, keeping them company. He was no longer the spoiled youngest who thought he deserved everything. He was a man trying with visible effort to be better than he had been. The following Christmas arrived with a completely different atmosphere. Martha spent weeks wondering if she should invite her children, if it was too soon, if the wound was still too open for a celebration. George, as always, left the decision to her. In the end, she decided to invite them. But this time, the rules were different. Dinner would be simple, no elaborate dishes, no overly lavish spread. Each person would bring something, and they would eat together, sharing not only the food, but the work of preparing it. And before any toast, before any gift, there would be a conversation. They arrived separately. Richard first, visibly thinner, his eyes carrying the weight of a difficult year. Diane came with Frank and the children, the kids running through the house as if nothing had happened, because for them, in fact, nothing had. Matthew arrived last, bringing flowers for his mother and a bottle of non-alcoholic wine for his father. When everyone was seated in the living room, Martha stood up. "Before anything else," she began, her voice firm but not harsh, "I need to say a few things, and I need you to listen until the end." The children exchanged apprehensive glances, but no one interrupted. "A year ago, at this very time, you tried to destroy me." She didn't soften the words. "You tried to destroy me and your father. Not physically, perhaps, but in every other way possible. You wanted to take away our dignity, our autonomy, everything we spent our lives building." Diane lowered her eyes. Richard swallowed hard. Matthew kept his gaze on his mother, accepting every word. "I won't lie and say I've completely forgiven you. Maybe I never will. What you did left a mark that won't disappear just because a year has passed. But I've decided one thing: I refuse to let your betrayal define my last years of life." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I am 83 years old. Your father is 85. We both know the time remaining isn't much, and I don't want to spend that time in anger, with resentment, estranged from my grandchildren, dwelling on what you did. That wouldn't be a punishment for you. It would be a punishment for myself." George stood up and went to his wife's side, holding her hand. "So I choose," Martha continued. "I choose to try again, not because you necessarily deserve it, but because I deserve it. Because I want to have a family again, even if it's a different family than the one I had before. And because, deep down, beneath all the resentment, I still love you. That love was hurt, it was betrayed, it was trampled, but it survived, and if it survived that, maybe it can survive the rest." The silence that followed was different from the silence of a year ago. It wasn't heavy, accusatory. It was a silence of absorption, of reflection, of children trying to process the generosity they didn't expect to find. Richard was the first to speak. "Mom," his voice broke, "I lost everything this year. My marriage, my daughter, my pride, and I know I deserved it. But to hear you say that, it's more than I deserve to receive." "You're right," Martha agreed. "It's more than you deserved, but it's what I'm offering. The question is, will you accept it and earn it, or will you waste it again?" He didn't answer with words. He simply stood up, crossed the room, and hugged his mother for the first time in months. It wasn't a perfect hug. It was clumsy, full of years of distance and distrust, but it was real. Diane came next, her eyes already filled with tears. Then Matthew, swallowing his sobs. For a moment, they were just a family hugging on Christmas Eve. Imperfect, wounded, but trying. Dinner took place in comfortable silence, interrupted only by the voices of the children who didn't understand why the adults were so emotional. They ate the food each had brought, toasted with non-alcoholic wine, exchanged simple gifts that meant more for the gesture than for the value. At midnight, as fireworks began to burst outside, Martha sat on the porch with George. The children had left, each for their own home, each carrying something different from that night. "Do you think it will work out?" George asked, his eyes fixed on the illuminated sky. Martha thought about the question. She thought about everything they had been through, everything they might still face. She thought about the children who were once innocent and who, in some way, had gotten lost along the way. She thought about the love that stubbornly existed despite everything. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But I'd rather have tried and failed than given up without trying. At least this way, when I'm gone, I'll know I did what I could." George nodded slowly. "That's the most anyone can do." They stayed there a little longer, holding hands, watching the fireworks paint the sky with ephemeral colors. They were two old people who had survived a storm and chosen not to let themselves sink. They didn't know what the future held. No one does. But they knew one thing. As long as there was life, there was possibility. And as long as there was possibility, it was worth continuing. The house gradually grew quiet. The fireworks dwindled. The neighbors' lights went out. Martha rose from her chair, extended her hand to her husband, and together they went inside. On the way to the bedroom, she passed through the living room, looked at the table still with remnants of dinner, at the chairs out of place, at the signs of a family that had been there. She smiled, a small, tired but genuine smile. It was Christmas. A Christmas different from all the others, marked by scars that might never completely disappear. But it was also a Christmas of new beginnings, of difficult choices made in the name of something greater than resentment. And in the end, that's what mattered. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.